For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates. This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh. Revi. Today we're discussing in our studios with Lisa Curtis, who's the director for the Indo-Pacific program with the Center for New American Security. We're looking at India-U.S. ties, China, the Indo-Pacific, and the Af-Pak region. Ms. Curtis, thank you for your time in an extremely busy and hectic schedule you have here in Delhi.
Well, it's just a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure's all ours, ma'am. Just wanted to look at your take on India-U.S. ties and the trajectory, and especially in the military sphere. It's 2+2 also. There's some talk, reports suggesting that even though both countries are going into election year, President Biden could possibly come as a Republic Day chief guest. But that's probably contingent of if the MQ-9B Reaper deal moves a little further. But your take on general India-U.S. ties?
Well, let me first say I certainly hope the MQ-9B deal moves forward. I worked on that when I was at the National Security Council a couple of years ago, so I know this has been a deal that's a long time in the making. And when I was in the administration, of course, we approved India receiving armed drones, the first non-NATO-ally country to be able to receive armed drones from the United States. So I hope that deal moves forward. I have a personal interest in that. But I think really the overall trajectory of the U.S.-India relationship is quite good. There is a very strong foundation now. We have the defense enabling agreements, trade is going well now with the defense relationship, and we have this breakthrough agreement where the U.S. and India are going to co-produce jet engines. This is really remarkable. Not even China has this capability to produce jet engines. So this was really an important milestone in the relationship. And you add on top of that the ISET dialogue, the Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies, where the U.S. is ready to work with India on AI, quantum computing, semiconductors. So there's a lot happening, especially on the defense and technology part of the relationship, which is important, I think, because if we're looking at China and, we have this technology race going on with China, there's concern about how they'll apply emerging technologies like AI to defense capabilities. So it's a really, it's a hands-on-deck situation, all hands-on-deck situation. And the U.S. needs India, India needs the U.S. To cooperate on these issues. And there's a lot of synergy in that tech relationship between the two countries. So I think we're at a high point for sure on the India-U.S. relationship. And there's been challenges. Let's face it, the Russia issue, divergent positions between India and the U.S. on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We have the Canada situation, the tensions between Canada and India. But still, I think we can see that the Biden administration wants to prioritize the relationship, move full steam ahead, keep the momentum going, and right through both countries' elections. If President Biden does visit in January, I think that will, really show his commitment to the country because, of course, he's going to be in full-on campaign mode by that point. So it would really be almost a miracle if he can find the time to come again to India because, of course, he was in India in September for the G20. So that will really be a strong signal of India's importance if he can come to New Delhi once again.
And these signals and capability, capacity building that's happening in terms of technology. I remember the last time we did an online chat with you was soon after you and Derek Grossman co-authored the CNAS paper. And one of the recommendations was exactly this. And like you said, it's been in your DNA for much longer on high tech being given to India. You did mention the China factor. Now, is that what is leading to this high point between India and U.S.? Is that the main driving force?
I think that's a primary driving force. I don't think it's the only driving force. And of course, the U.S.-India relationship has been expanding and growing over the last 20-odd years, whether it's a Democratic administration or a Republican administration. So I think, what we see is the U.S. and India are becoming more than partners. They'll never be allies. Let's face it, that's not going to happen. But it feels like the relationship is even more than a partnership. Maybe let's call it partnership plus. But that's happened over a long period of time. It's been building and growing. But as China becomes more aggressive, as the U.S. recognizes that the competition with China is the most important challenge that the United States faces. This has come out in the national security strategy that was released last year by the Biden administration. It was acknowledged that this is the number one national security challenge for the U.S. is this competition with China. So as we see China come more into focus for the United States, then naturally a focus will be on India as well, because India has an important role to play in the Indo-Pacific, being such a powerful country, a powerful democracy with a large military, a capable military, a growing navy and naval capabilities. So India plays an extremely important role in trying to ensure that China cannot dominate the region, both in terms of its own power and influence militarily, but also on the technological front. So I think the U.S. and India have a mutual interest in that, and that certainly is a major driver behind all the progress that we've seen over the last couple of years in India-U.S. relations.
And India is the only country which has had actual deadly clashes between our forces and China. But you would be familiar with this strand of Indian foreign policy, it's called strategic autonomy now, and especially those who drive policy or make policy or shape policy who are skeptical about the U.S. and the West, partly because of historical reasons, partly because we see America having abandoned its partners or partners plus over the years, and partly is because they don't want to be seen or don't want India to be seen as an appendage or a stooge, something like, in their reading, what Ukraine is being used by the U.S. against Russia. They don't want to be in that kind of position.
Well, I'm going to have to disagree with you on that, Amitabh.
It's not
sure
me.
you understand.
Yeah.
I think that, look, if we're talking about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you have one, large country invading another illegally, unjustly. It's a useless war. Even Prime Minister Modi has said this is not a time of war. So I think, we all should want to see Ukraine succeed in this war, because the precedent that it would set if Russia can get away with this, just, taking over another country's territory, that will set a very bad precedent for the Indo-Pacific region and encourage China to also exercise such aggression, particularly against Taiwan. So I think everybody should want to see Ukraine succeed. And we should all remember that it was Russia that initiated the war, totally unprovoked. So I think this is something that the U.S. would see as a reason for people coming together to support Ukraine so that it can stand up to Russian aggression. And it's the same in the Indo-Pacific. The U.S. wants to see the smaller countries in the Indo-Pacific and Southeast Asia be able to protect their own sovereignty and independence. And what we see from China is that they are increasingly using these gray zone tactics. These are tactics that are serve the purpose of intimidating and coercing, but they're at this level, it's below the threshold that would provoke a military response, but they're still trying to change the status quo. And this is something we need to push back on as well. But I think your question was
On strategic autonomy, India being seen as an independent player, not say as a proxy in the the U.S.-China confrontation.
Yeah, I don't think that is even a question of this idea that India would be the cat's paw for the United States in getting at China, because it was India and China that had a border crisis in 2020. And I think, that changed India's strategic perceptions and strategic orientation because, again, for no reason, unjustified, unprovoked, China posted up at different points along the LAC, coming into areas that India considers, its territory. India could not patrol in certain areas that had been able to previously because of the Chinese military position. So very provocative situation. You had a major clash, first time soldiers dying on the LAC since 1975. So that's a completely different situation. There's no question of the U.S. using India. It's a question of the United States wants to see India, be able to protect its own sovereignty and have the capabilities that it needs to also stand up to China and to extend its soft power. India has a lot of soft power going for it. Being a large democracy, India can have the positive influence and contribute to maintaining a free and open and transparent regional order in the Indo-Pacific. So I think that's how the United States sees India's role. It's not about using India.
Fair enough. Since you talk about the Indo-Pacific, one country that really comes to mind of late is the Philippines and how it's pushing back with, of course, its treaty ally, the U.S. And you were referring to, that trigger that would push it over that. And now even Japan. The Philippines is a great example of pushback against China's aggressive behavior.
Yeah, and again, I come back to the idea that, all countries that believe in a legal framework and a stable global order, a rules-based or norms-based order, can see that, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the use, of aggression and threatening a country's sovereignty and independence. Well, China's doing the same thing in the Indo-Pacific. And so we just don't want to give any encouragement to that kind of behavior. And as you rightly point out, the Philippines right now is facing this from China. China has been using tactics like lasering. It trained military-grade lasers on a Philippines Coast Guard vessel back in February, trying to prevent the Philippines Coast Guard from resupplying an outpost that they have in the Spratly Islands. Did the similar thing in August when China used water cannons against a Philippines vessel. And then most recently, just a couple of weeks ago, we actually had a collision, a very large Chinese Coast Guard ship cutting off a Philippines Coast Guard vessel. So China is using this intimidation and coercion against smaller Southeast Asian nations. And it's really important that the U.S. Show these countries that it has their back, that it will stand by its commitments, in the case of Philippines, 70-year-old treaty commitments, and that we restate the importance of the 2016 international arbitral ruling, which ruled against China's expansive maritime claims. China claims about 90% of the South China Sea as its own. So, the countries themselves need to stand up, and the Philippines is leading the way, very, very creative way. A few weeks ago, they disguised a Coast Guard vessel, a fishing vessel, and cut these buoys, removed these buoys that were keeping Philippine fishermen out of their rightful fishing areas out of Philippines EEZ. So, they can show other countries how they also can stand up to China. And I think this is very important.
And they're pulling out of PRI projects, which is sending a huge signal. From our east, that's India's east, if I can move west, where again you've worked extensively, both in academics and in government, Pakistan, and how your reading of the situation economically, politically, the military being involved there, and then I'll move further west to Afghanistan, which is, of course, another forte of yours. How do you see that? Is Pakistan on the way, if not already a failing state?
Well, I think we've been, asking this question for many, many years. Pakistan is a state that sort of lives in perpetual crisis mode. And, right now they're facing a teetering economy. The economy's not doing well at all, but also a great deal of political instability. I think the military, has put Imran Khan in jail. I think they're fearful of his power to bring people on the streets. So in a way, it shows the military's weakness that they have to jail who they consider a political opponent on trumped-up charges. So unfortunately, democracy is really suffering in Pakistan right now. And on top of that, on top of the economic problems, the political crisis, you have a terrorism crisis. Since the Taliban took over Afghanistan 2 years ago, we've seen the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, the TTP, strengthening. Now, the situation is not as dire as it was in the 2007 to 2014 period, which, there were incessant terrorist attacks in Pakistan. So thankfully, the situation is not that bad, but it's still problematic. We saw an attempted attack on a Pakistani air base at Mianwali, which is concerning. So I think, Pakistan has some challenges that it's facing. We certainly don't want Pakistan to implode. So I think it's in everybody's interest that, that we support Pakistan and make sure that, they don't reach a point where, the problems come together in some kind of dire scenario. Pakistan is a nuclear weapon state. It's important that the military stay firmly in control of those nuclear capabilities. So, it is a concern. Pakistan's a concern. But I don't see that it's much different than it's been in years past.
You talked about the TTP and the ratcheting up of attacks post the Taliban taking over in Kabul. There have been clashes along the Durand line, words exchanged on both sides. Now the deportation of anywhere between 1.4 to 1.8 million Afghans from Pakistan. How do you read that situation in terms of those who say Taliban has been able to move out of Rawalpindi or GHQ's ISI's control? Is it asserting any independence from?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me talk about the deportation of Afghan refugees. This is absolutely a terrible situation. Many of these people have lived for years in Pakistan. Pakistan has played host to Afghan refugees going back to, the Soviet invasion in the early 1980s. So, many of these people have made a life in Pakistan. And this is just a terrible situation. Pakistan has been roundly criticized by the UN, many other countries, for essentially, pushing these Afghan refugees out and creating, even more of a crisis, for Afghanistan and Pakistan, for these people. So I think, that is an issue that the U.S. is going to need to raise more forcefully. Obviously, we appreciate that Pakistan has been housing these refugees. They deserve international support for housing these refugees. But certainly we can't countenance them just, pushing these refugees out, back to Afghanistan against their will. We've seen other situations like the Rohingya, for example, and Bangladesh has, taken care of the Rohingya. It's not been easy for them, but you don't see a country like Bangladesh sort of pushing the Rohingya back into Myanmar. So this is an unacceptable situation. I think you asked about, Pakistan's influence with the Taliban. Certainly it's waning compared to what it was when the Taliban found sanctuary in Pakistan. They had a bit more leverage at that point. But now the Taliban controls its own country. It's feeling, pretty good about its hold on power. Pakistan does not have the kind of leverage to be able to, have the Taliban do the things it wants to do, which right now is they would want the Taliban to be cracking down on TTP terrorists in Afghanistan. But the Taliban is not taking orders from Islamabad. And I think that was quite predictable. That, even though Pakistan, wanted to see the Taliban back in power, did everything it could to make that scenario happen, they should have been able to foresee that once that happened, they weren't going to be able to control the direction of terrorism in the region. That seemed obvious, I think, to people in the United States. It should have been obvious to Pakistan's military.
Even though you were part of the negotiations for the Doha deal, you have been very forthcoming in criticizing how it was conducted and the outcomes of that. Very strong words there that you used. But how do you see engagement with the Taliban now, post them taking over, especially, let me first deal with the U.S. Because there are reports suggesting that there's talk about investment of U.S. business members, council members are also meeting the Taliban, even though U.S. officials haven't made it back to Kabul as yet. The U.S. engagement with the Taliban, how do you read that currently?
Well, I think the U.S. should be conditioning their engagement on the Taliban's treatment of women and girls. It's absolutely a travesty what is happening to the women and girls in Afghanistan. It's persecution, it's gender apartheid. And I think that the U.S. needs to make that more a part of their discussions with the Taliban. This is the only country in the world that is denying education to its girls, denying women the ability to work, in some cases to even leave their home without a male companion. We see that women and young women are becoming more and more hopeless about their future. So we're seeing more and more suicides amongst the female population. So this is actually a terrible situation, and it's the world cannot look away. Look, the U.S. invested hundreds of millions of dollars in NGOs supporting women, supporting women's rights, empowering them. It can't simply turn away from this population. So I would like to see that more a part of our discussions. And I also think the idea that the Taliban can somehow be a counterterrorism partner of the United States is very far-fetched. Just because the U.S. and the Taliban both oppose ISIS-K does not mean that the Taliban is going to help the United States, on all of the terrorism problems that are there. This is because they're still allied with Al-Qaeda. They still have close ties with Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups. And they're also building up a terrorist infrastructure. They're opening new madrasas where they're inculcating young men in their extremist ideology. Many of these young men are going to grow up to be terrorists, let's face it. So, this is a situation that rather than thinking in tactical terms, we should be thinking strategically and trying to prevent Afghanistan from turning into a terrorist safe haven or, a basket case again.
On that account, Ms. Curtis, how do you see India's low-key yet what we call a technical team engagement with the Taliban after initially leaving?
Well, I think India, again, is taking a very tactical approach to Afghanistan. I think India calculates that it has more to gain by engaging with the Taliban and being in Afghanistan, being able to keep its eyes on what's happening in the country. Because, India's had problems in the past with terrorist groups finding sanctuary, terrorist groups that, fight in India. This is Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed. So I think, their goal is to try to work with the Taliban to get their, counterterrorism needs met, to try to ensure that groups that target India cannot flourish in Afghanistan. So, I can appreciate that they're taking a very tactical approach with the Taliban. I'm just not sure how this is going to work out in the long run because, we need to stay away from legitimizing the Taliban because, we can't legitimize a regime that is still supporting some terrorist groups, supporting, these extremist ideologies that will lead to more terrorism, and repressing 50% of its population. So, I would like to see India, just like I would like to see the United States raising the issue of women and girls more in its engagement with the Taliban.
Lisa Curtis, absolutely. Again, appreciate your time, you sharing both your experience and your expertise with us. Thank you again so much.
Thank you.
And for all our viewers, do send us feedback about this interview. Follow all our social media handles for the latest that we put up on our website or interviews like this with Lisa Curtis on our YouTube channel. This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi.